She stood before the people and she stood before God as being responsible for teaching and guiding those under her, both male and female. Women in the Old Testament who are prominent. Isaiah's wife was a prophetess. There were women who served at the door of the temple or the tabernacle. And I did have that book online, Women's Ministry. I don't know if it's still there or what form it's in now, because I did do some alteration. Now this is what this man Lumpkin says, this brilliant scholar. He says women in the New Testament are usually glossed over. In the beginning, they had stations and positions. Some ran churches out of their homes. Now Paul did say, I do not suffer women to teach. Well, one explanation by some scholars is that because those women were so uneducated, they couldn't. Well, I don't quite agree with that. I did see another explanation years ago that said, for the time being, I suffer women not to teach on account of all the persecution that was happening in that area. But Paul never followed the idea of not suffering women to teach, because you'll find in Romans chapter 16 a whole list of women apostles, women evangelists, women pastors. And there are other women in the New Testament who were pastors, not in Paul's list. So we look at the chapter in Romans about Phoebe, verse 1. Now I read years ago that Theodoret, a prominent theologian of the Assyrian church about AD 300, said, in relation to Phoebe, Phoebe was an apostle. So even he knew it 300 years or so later. And that's what the word really means when he calls her a servant. And she is a sucker of many and of himself. Now that doesn't mean that she went around handing out food and clothing. It meant she gave spiritual assistance. We don't think of Paul as needing spiritual assistance. Of course he did. Paul was human like everybody else. Despite being the great apostle that he was and the apostle to the Gentiles, Paul had his failings. He sinned. I think it was Luke. He took to the temple and had him shaved. Now that's not the action of somebody who preaches according to Galatians, is it? And there are other matters about Paul. He wasn't perfect, but he did live a sanctified, godly, spirit-filled life walking with Jesus. So the word translated servant is said to be deacon. No, she's a servant. She was running a church, or a succorer. In other words, that means one standing before a champion, leader, chief, or protector. She stood before Paul, a woman. And this idea that men are the priests of their own household that I used to hear, that's absolute rubbish. If you look at history, those who influenced their children to become great men, like for instance John Wesley and Charles Wesley, was always the mother, always the woman. Now, I do recognize this. It is wonderful and most helpful and possibly very important that a young Christian boy has the example of a godly father and the wise words of a godly father. Most important. I had it in both mother and father, and many another Christian has it. We recognize that the male is certainly the dominant figure and the predominant person, but he's not the boss. And so Phoebe wasn't the boss either, but she would have instructed Paul. If she's standing before a champion leader, chief or protector, she gives some instruction. And I know that by experience. Of course you do. She stood before the people and she stood before God as being responsible for teaching and guiding those under her, both male and female. This should make us shiver in our boots. The responsibility of teaching and guiding, both male and female. In 1 Timothy 3:12 we read this in English. I command unto you Phoebe, our sister, minister of the church, which is at Cenchrea, for she has been a ruler of many, and of myself also. This is the noun corresponding to the verb translated rule. Now, reading from Romans 16 in the Amplified Bible, now I introduce and commend to you our sister, Phoebe, a deaconess of the church at Cenchrea, that you may receive her in the Lord as God's people. Help her in whatever manner she may require assistance from you. For she has been a helper of many, including myself, shielding us from suffering. Then he said, give my greetings to Prisca and Aquila. Well, the Pentecostals always did say, the wife is mentioned before the husband here, because she was the outstanding preacher and teacher. Far more outstanding preacher and teacher than ever was her husband. And by the time we went overseas to Indonesia, I had so been intimidated by certain pastors who were not intimidating me, just giving me advice, such as, now you can't be like Sister so-and-so. She was a hindrance to her husband pastor. And of course, so I think inside, I don't want to be like that. This happened when we were first there together in ministering a rather large church in Solo. The pastor said to the translator, well, Sister Bonnie has a better ministry than her husband. He told me. I said to myself, oh, that can't be. I quit. Now that was very wrong. I should have had more sense of the presence of God than to do that. But I did, and let him go on while I stood in the background, pushing him and doing what I could. And he had a marvelous ministry. He had a wonderful healing ministry, one of the best I've ever seen. And so God does pursue his purposes and wills in our lives if we somehow or other encourage him somewhere along the line. Because later on, I just got into full-time ministry myself. Then he says, greet Mary, who's worked hard amongst you. Greet Andronicus and Junius, my tribal kinsmen. They are men in high esteem. So forth, he goes on, and I have counted the number of women that were in this. I looked up their meanings in the Greek, and I forget now how many it was I counted years ago. Very, very, very many. So women played a prominent part in the ministry of the Apostle Paul. Lumpkin also says this, our beliefs are coloured by our society. We have to attempt to take away the veil of looking at the 1611 society in which King James Version translators were immersed to find the truth. In other words, the translators of the King James Bible, and I've often thought this, were so used to the culture of the church of their time that of course it coloured their translation. Now I have seen that in the Indonesian Bible, And I pointed it out to the British and Foreign Bible Society in Singapore, and they agreed and said they were going to alter it. I saw the same in the Tamil Bible in India and was visiting with them and preaching to them, and I pointed it out and they said, yes, we know, we have to correct it. You see? The colour of the heathen culture actually had gotten into the Bible. Because who helped the first translator of the Bible from English into Tamil, who I think was an English person? A Hindu scholar. Hindu. Of course he's going to influence the Bible. They influenced the Bible in the King James time. Now let me say this, they only influenced. They didn't totally remove the truths, but in the Tamil Bible they have. In the Tamil Bible, as I have found out from inquiry, there's a certain verse in Ephesians talking about, in English, how Christ sanctified his church by the water of the word. The Tamil Bible says Christ sanctified his church by the water of baptism. A very big distinction. And when they told me that, I was horrified. And actually some Assembly of God pastors told me, yes, they knew it was there. They knew it was wrong because they knew English. And they were correcting it in their teaching. So there you have it. After the Geneva Bible and the King James Bible were accepted as the Word of God, other Bible translations were expected to follow their meaning closely, and that's what's been going on. I have said for a long time I wish there were earlier Greek manuscripts that somebody could translate, but there don't appear to be any. Thus many modern translators may see the truth more clearly than they can convey, because error propagates error. As a footnote, it is interesting to see that in Acts 18, Priscilla instructs Apollos. He says the man who some think wrote the book of Hebrews. No, he didn't, because Apollos didn't know the apostles. Priscilla was the one who instructed Apollos, and I believe, and others do too, that Priscilla wrote the book of Hebrews. She was a highly educated woman. Now this is what some of the translators of the Bible have done. They've done away with the woman by changing their name to that of a man. In Romans 16 verse 7, Paul praises a woman named Junia as outstanding among the apostles. King James, salute Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen. But of course, as I looked it up years ago, Junia is a feminine name. Junia is not a masculine name at all. Now Young's literal translation says this, salute Andronicus and Junius, who were of note among the apostles. That's all. He doesn't say that they were kinsmen. It says my kindred. The New International Version says my relatives. Now so many people blacken the new NIV, they think is almost of the devil. Well, they had this verse right, and Young's is different from the King James. Has nothing to do with kinsmen. They were kindred. Now in relation to Romans 16 verse 7, which is Junia, a woman, this is what Chrysostom wrote, the one I was speaking to you about before. Oh, how great is the devotion of this woman, that she should be counted worthy of the appellation of apostle. Now he wrote that maybe about AD 390, 400. And he was in the Roman Catholic Church. Bishop of, or the church that preceded it, Bishop of Constantinople. So what they have done, translators have made up the name Junius to substitute the actual name. Now we look at the second epistle of John, which of course is in my book also. And it's to the lady. In the NIV, to the lady chosen by God and to her children. In Young's literal translation, the elder to the choice Kyria and her children. Wycliffe, the elder man to the chosen lady. The elder man to the lady elector and to her children. So they were women who were pastors. Now, of course, the men who don't like that idea just says, oh, when John writes lady, he's talking about the church. She's a lady. Well, you know, that's a bit ridiculous, isn't it? You don't call any church a lady. A lady's a lady, a woman. And that indeed is what she was. She was a pastor. And she had a house full of people when they came to her meetings. She bishoped them. She shepherded them. She was their elder. She was their pastor, whichever word you like to choose.